Kaiju games are a fascinating subject, as I'm a big fan of kaiju as a whole, though I don't really know much about the kaiju games themselves. I was always more of a Godzilla guy and played a couple of his games as they came out, though exploring outside of his particular niche genre was never something I thought about. So, we'll define kaiju games, at least in this first part, as a game in which you take control of kaiju. That ruled out several candidates, and I should mention as well, this is going to be the first kaiju video game retrospective of sorts. There's a problem whenever I started this video with volume. This video is the first of 3, and I'm gonna work on other videos in between here as well, but here's how the division of videos works. There is a video that is going to be about general kaiju games, the games without any real affiliation, with some major properties within them. The exception, of course, being King Kong, who is, I'd consider a major property, but doesn't have enough games to justify him. And then there are the Godzilla and Ultraman games, who alone have a grand total of 117 games, Godzilla having 55 and Ultraman having 61. So compared to this part 1, which should contain about 30, it's a giant issue of depth and volume. So I broke this up into several parts for the sake of my own sanity of reviewing 117 games in a single video is going to be crazy. There are also still major IPs within this. I mean, half of these games are from the Rampage series, which isn't a big IP in my opinion. It had a movie, so I mean, that boosted status, but the movie was mediocre, so it's here nor there. And further qualifying kaiju games in particular is if you play as a kaiju as a central mechanic or entirely throughout the game. Large creatures or monsters don't count. I more or less play it by ear as well, so if there are some games that do fall under this category or are missing from this category, let me know. It's an oversight on my part. I just can't exactly see every single kaiju game 100%. I did my best. So with fluctuation of detail as well within these games, as I feel some are warranted having more detail and others, as you'll see, are more or less copy and paste easy info. The earliest I can find is a 1981 game called Crush, Crumble, and Chomp, released on multiple consoles over time, such as the TRS-80, the Apple II, and various 8-bit Atari systems, and then was later ported to VIC-20, the Commodore 64, and other DOS systems. The developers who made the game were called Automated Simulations, though they later rebranded as Epics, with a Y, not, I don't think, the Epic of today, and was headed by John Freeman and Jim Connolly. The game, as you can see, is an interesting concept that I'm probably not that good at. The game features kaiju such as Godzilla, an amphibian like Godzilla, Kraken, the Kraken, Arachnus, a giant spider equivalent to Kumongo, Glob, a blob-esque monster, Machismo, a robotic alien thing, and Mantra, a flying monster. You have your kaiju of choice, along with also having the ability to create a custom kaiju, which is essentially where you mold parts from other monsters. The game, as far as I'm aware, was well received, but not great. The game is styled after monster movies, but they're more scaled based on the images appearing more like kaiju. It also features the ability to get a high score via different objectives, though there are no actual end to the game, with it only finishing when your character should starve or get killed. The game was also remade later by Epix into the movie monster game. This one actually did feature Godzilla and a knockoff Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. So next released was Kong in 1982, developed by Tiger Vision. It's basically Donkey Kong, but, King Kong. The graphics are much worse in this iteration than Donkey Kong, and doesn't really work in the sense of getting an authentic version of King Kong. And since it really has nothing to do with the character themselves, it was probably a quick tie-in game, if I had to guess, to make a quick buck with the movie. Now we're going out of chronological order already, so we've got King Kong 2 Ikari no Megaton Punch, or King Kong 2 The Furious Megaton Punch, which are both really cool names. They were released in December 1986. This follows a King Kong who's been unconscious after being knocked off the World Trade Center, and has been unconscious for 10 years. When a female Kong-sized gorilla is also captured, they plan on giving Kong a blood transfusion of her blood and give him a new artificial heart. He then proceeds to escape and attempts to mate with his companion, a novel concept, and this was developed by none other than Konami. And despite the 2 in its name, it isn't related specifically to the previous King Kong game, but the second movie, King Kong Lives. At least in the West, and then it was called King Kong 2 in Japan, which is why it has the 2 in the name. The game seems to be well-liked, not loved, and is very similar to Zelda. You go through 9 different levels, fight the different bosses, and after winning the final boss, you rescue Lady Kong, and then you have a baby Kong, which means King Kong lives on. Also released in December 1986 was King Kong Yomigaru Densetsu, or King Kong Revive 2, also developed by Konami, surprisingly. This game is one of those exceptions to my rules, mostly because it is one of the 4 King Kong games, and you don't control King Kong himself. You follow what I believe to be the second movie's main character, Hank Mitchell. The game plays similar to a 2D like Zelda, more so than the previous game. Along with several resources, you have XP, life, magic, and gold. And then you also have other mechanics such as level and days. Your goal, unlike the prior game, is to free Kong so he can be back with his new love interest, Lady Kong. The game features 3 different endings, surprisingly. The bad end, which means King Kong dies, obviously, since you took too long. The neutral ending is that King Kong has the transfusion with Lady Kong and he ends up living. And the best ending being where you save Kong's life, and of course he mates with Lady Kong, and there's a baby Kong. The game overall was reviewed as fairly okay, nothing stellar seems. So we're going to return to chronological order. We wind back to 3 years ago in 1983, the release of Daiku no Gyakushu, an arcade cabinet game featuring another giant lizard who has laser eyes and fire breath going by the name of... It doesn't have a name, actually. It's safe to assume that this is pretty much a carbon copy of Godzilla, given that the theme that plays in the game is the Godzilla's franchise's military march, which is honestly the best part of the game in my opinion. You play through 5 stages, which then loop afterward. The game is developed by Taito Corporation, a game studio which is surprisingly still around today, and has made nothing notable up till now. And from what looks to come in the future, it seems like they're not planning to. Back to 1986, released one of the biggest franchises in this video is the first Rampage game. The first Rampages feature our 3 major sets of monsters, the iconic Ralph, Lizzie, and George, the mutated humans via the experiments of Scum Labs, who are now monsters. It's the most bare bones of the Rampage games, which makes sense given it's the first game. Your goal is to avoid being hit and destroy buildings while going on a rampage. Surprise, surprise. The game is albeit simple, and one could argue technically not a kaiju game based on the scale of the creatures, and I'd argue that's fair, but they still count for the sake of this list, as I feel they have a big part in kaiju as a whole. Arrgh is the next game on this list, developed in 1987 and published by Melbourne House, released on several arcade cabinets and was subsequently released on platforms such as Amiga, Commodore 64, and MSX, along with quite a few others. More surprisingly, the game's Amiga releases were handled by none other than EA at the time. The game features 2 large monsters, an ogre and a lizard creature. They're tasked to destroy various villages and settlements in search of a Roc's egg, which allows you to progress to presumably find a golden Roc's eggs, to presumably exact revenge on the humans on the island. The game plays relatively fine, with the most difficult matter likely being the game's most pivotal system, its movement, which feels clunky in ways lacking. The game was reviewed and received some mixed reviews, with either it getting decent to very positive scores, and lower scores following the inverse trend. Our next title was released 4 years after in 1991. It was called King of the Monsters. It was developed by SNK. The gameplay is what I'd say is like a Kaiju WWE wrestling match at ridiculous stature. Your goal, like most wrestling matches, is to pin your opponent, with that goal getting easier as the health of them gets lower, and the subsequent pinning after. This one offers very little in terms of variety of gameplay, however, as you're pretty much climbing an ever-difficult ladder of opponents within the character roster. There's also this power-up system that I can't quite understand, but I think it may make pinning easier and some more damage for your attacks. There seems to be more complicated mechanics, though I can't quite comprehend them on the surface level of playing. The manual also somewhat explains a story involving technology creating the kaijus, along with a global catastrophe looming, and they have somewhat fleshed out stories, which is interesting. Beetlemania, who's the one I'm playing, is a beetle from the Amazon who apparently has low intelligence and just likes destroying everything. A sequel was developed a year later in 1992, dubbed King of the Monsters 2: The Next Thing, which actually shakes up the gameplay quite a lot. The Next Thing actually stars only 3 characters, a downgrade from the first game, which removes Beetlemania, my favorite character, so I liked it a bit less than the prior title. The game takes place 3 years after, and the monsters are effectively on top of the world, and there's an alien invasion. It was originally released on the Neo Geo, but when ported from the SNES and the Sega Genesis, it returned to a top-down style of play, in which followed the boss characters being added as playable characters, the exception being the final boss of the game. The side-scroller version surprisingly features several endings, with it being determined by the player's destruction after the final boss. These good endings are really just additional bonus stages, however, and both games, again, were developed by SNK, with the exceptions of 2's SNES port version being developed by Now Production, and the Sega Genesis port being developed by B-Top. The game seemed to have gotten mixed reviews, mainly dependent at what system you were playing it on, and decently popular as an arcade cabinet. No real sequel, however, has been made since then. Next is a title called Beast Fighter, and the information I can find on it is little to none of its actual existence. It was developed by a Taiwanese company called Sachen that developed a handful of games. The game was released on the Game Boy and a system called the Game Duck, which I hadn't heard about till the analysis of this video. When trying to emulate the game, I could only find it on an incredibly sketchy website, and there's only a single YouTube video of what I believe is to be the game playing, which should be in the background now. It looks interesting, but I've got no way to play it and give my actual opinions. Next is honestly one of my favorite examples of what can be considered kaiju games, Primal Rage, released in 1994, and we'll also briefly mention its unreleased sequel. So, Primal Rage is a spectacular game released originally on arcade cabinets and plays as a typical 2D fighter, though all the characters are animated using stop-motion claymation, a style reminiscent of Ray Harryhausen's works, and in terms of video games was similar to Mortal Kombat. The story of the game is fascinating, with 7 playable characters who are dubbed gods by the lore of the game fight each other for dominance of the planet they're on, which is basically Earth in the far post-apocalyptic future called Earth with a U. The game was developed by Atari Games and actually had a fair bit of controversy around its violence and some of the fatalities, similar to Mortal Kombat. The game sold well with roughly 1.5 million units, and yet despite this, the sequel was cancelled as Atari sought to continue the story via other means, in a novel called Primal Rage: The Avatars. There was in fact a game or several test cabinets actually finished though for a sequel, and it appeared throughout several venues, and there was supposedly a completely finished cabinet that was shown off. Someone eventually managed to find and dump the game, however, and while no emulator was able to run it at the time, a modified adaptation of the MAME system allows people to play it, so if you're interested in that, I'd highly suggest looking it up. This is where I'm going to briefly mention the Gamera titles that are all pretty much in this block. I'm not going to list the games by name, but none of them fit my definition as you can't play as Gamera himself in any of the games I can find. Back to Rampage, we have Rampage World Tour, a sequel that was 11 years in the making and released in 1997. Once again, released initially only on arcade cabinets, it was featured on all sorts of systems after, from the original PlayStation to the Game Boy Color. The game is, well, still Rampage, but features an increasing level of stories such as Eustace Demonic, the CEO of Scum Labs, who are responsible for creating the titular characters, along with Vern, a form that our tritagonist can take after consuming some toxic waste, and Vern stands for violently enraged radioactive nemesis. We're also introduced to Dr. Elizabeth Veronica, who was included to encourage some people into playing it for obvious reasons, including the final cutscene of the game. It was published by Midway Games again, but was actually developed by Game Refugee Inc., though there were several developers returning from the first game. It had some middling success, though that likely stems from it largely being the same game as the first, but with a handful of adjustments. In a surprising twist of events is Rampage 2 Universal Tour, released in 1999. It's the third game in the franchise, which I think implies World Tour is a reboot as a whole rather than just a simple sequel. This time we're introduced to 3 new monsters called Ruby, Boris, and Curtis. Our standard 3, Ralph, Lizzie, and George, have been sent around the world and are being held after Scum Labs' failures. Europe takes Ralph, which is a reference to werewolves in London, and there are several other puns that go along with George and Lizzie being taken. The 3 monsters then go around the world, break out the other original 3, which, upon succeeding said rescue attempt, there's this alien invasion in which Mucus, a cycloptic alien, invades, and who, after we defeat, ends up destroying his own homeworld. The game still had mediocre reviews, with repetition being its main problem. Also, Dr. Elizabeth Veronica doesn't make an appearance, and the wiki makes a note that people were disappointed that she didn't make a return. Once again, for obvious reasons. Surprise, surprise, more Rampage. In 2000, dubbed Rampage Through Time, which, believe it or not, features time travel, our 6th antagonist, or protagonist, depending on how you look at it, they escape alongside Mucus, who receives a recolor in this game, and Harley the Warthog, who is apparently a PlayStation exclusive character. You play through several time periods and end up competing against 2 other monsters at any given time, and then, after several missions, you end up fighting. You get a minigame, which I was not a fan of. I'd play well, and mind you, getting to the minigame takes a while, and if you didn't understand the minigame, you'd end up failing, and that'd be essentially a game over, which was quite annoying to say the least. The game was still developed by Midway Games, and the reviews, again, are middling, leaning towards a negative, which really begins to make me wonder how the Rampage series survived, considering none of the games were ever received favorably. Briefly, I'll mention Rampage Puzzle Attack, a game I've left off this list kind of because I can't tell exactly if you're playing as one of the monsters themselves or technically the pieces. Either way, it's legitimately the worst puzzle game I think I've ever played. Finally, moving out of the string of Rampage titles is War of the Monsters, a 2003 PS2 title developed by the Twisted Metal developers Incognito Entertainment. The game resembles that of Godzilla's Pipework games, which are very fun and will be discussed later in the Godzilla video. It's very fast-paced, and my main negative about it is the energy system that it takes to actually fight is kind of holding it back. A lot of the monsters also seem to pull more so from Universal's B-movie monsters, rather than them ripping off ideas from Godzilla's Kaiju, which most series already do. It's cheesy and fun, and though I feel the speed of it is what holds it back in my opinion, as kaiju and giant monsters need to have a certain weight to them in my opinion again. The game garnered generally favorable reviews, which is a sound for sore ears considering all these strings of poor reviews from the Rampage titles. Out of games on this list, as a pure kaiju game, I think this one stands out as my favorite. I Was an Atomic Mutant is another 2003 Windows game that I can't find a way to play, and was developed by ValueSoft. The game, in similar fashion to War of the Monsters, shares a fascination with B-movie monsters. Though it has a, blandish execution, there appears to be no kaiju on kaiju combat. Instead, you're destroying these homes alongside their vacant surroundings. Reminds me of those nuclear testing towns, and your only enemies being the military makes it bland. Beyond the giant creature designs, a robot, a Godzilla knockoff, a floating alien-esque brain, and the 50-foot giant woman, it looks repetitive, but overall the designs are fine. Falling under my technically list are the next King Kong games, both released in 2005. Peter Jackson's King Kong and King Kong the Eighth Wonder. The first seeing releases on multiple platforms and the latter on only Game Boy, it seems. They're on the technical side, as for most of these games you play as Peter Jackson's character, Jack Driscoll, and are given moments of gameplay for King Kong. And these are honestly the best versions of King Kong to date. Even outside of the non-Game Boy games, it's a decent FPS, which each seem to have some distinct differences depending on which platform you're playing on. The games were developed by Ubisoft, and the game got generally positive reviews, with the exception of the DS and PSP versions. Technically, it's not a kaiju game, but you do get to play as King Kong in this, and it's his best iteration again to date. Rampage Total Destruction was the final game released in the Rampage franchise to date, in 2006. Minus the arcade game made for the movie tie-in, which was just a reskin of the original, it stands as the best iteration of the Rampage formula. It was created by none other than Pipeworks Software, the ones who made the trilogy of Godzilla games I mentioned earlier. The game evolved the formula into a 4-person multiplayer rather than the traditional 3 of the prior games, and features, depending on which system you picked it up on, between 30 or 40 new characters, an unprecedented 32 new members to the cast. As much as this appears to be the best received Rampage game, with some exceptions, the main problem is that once again, the Rampage formula remaining largely stagnant. Personally, I think it would have been an improvement for the games to feature the top-down perspective of the Pipeworks Godzilla titles, but with an emphasis on citywide destruction and enhancing the militaristic antagonists. The game sold well, and no Rampage game has been made since. In 2010, there's a game called Eat Them that was developed by a studio called Fluffy Logic and was apparently intended to be a spiritual successor to Rampage, which is a short time span for a spiritual successor, in my opinion, considering that the series had only been dormant for 3 years to that point. The game featured a body type of a monster kaiju and allowed you to fit it with several different body parts and various weaponries, a la a action figure assemble with various parts. The art style also seems brilliantly poignant in the game and is this beautiful cel-shaded visual spectacle. The game, based on all reviews, is in fact an evolution of Rampage's formula as a whole, but it's troublesome when you realize that evolving a formula of a game where its problem is being repetitive means you're probably going to run into repetition. The mindless destruction apparently wasn't enough to impress reviewers, and as far as I can tell, this is the final game that the indie studio released and intends on releasing. Again, briefly to mention the 2018 Rampage arcade game that was based on the movie and looks like a poor reskin of the original Rampage game. In comes 2020 and the resurgence of Kaiju. Technically, the next big game started in 2021, but I'm gonna call it the resurgence of 2020 nonetheless. Excedio, the Kaiju game released in July of 2021, is an early access game that features an unnamed Godzilla-esque kaiju that destroys a city. The game has a nice voxel art style, but from what I can tell, somewhat limited in its scope as of now, though hopefully subsequent updates will further flesh it out. Next, in latter 2021, is Gigopolis, which is somewhat 2D rail type of kaiju game, which you upgrade as you go and get better abilities. You've got a total of 9 characters and seem to have various skins for each of them. That looks fascinating in terms of gameplay, but definitely comes off to me as a mobile game, which it is, and it's also on Steam, but is significantly cheaper on mobile, so I recommend getting it there rather if that interests you at all. 2022 arrived and features 4 major kaiju releases that I shall be discussing, as there are a handful of others, but I don't feel they're that relevant to this video. Dawn of the Monsters, a 2.5D style beat-em-up kaiju game with another gorgeous art style, using hard lighting and a manga-esque complexion. You choose between 4 fighters, and it features a 2-player co-op, so you can play with a friend. Most interestingly, the game is getting a DLC soon, and it had a poll to decide which of the 3 characters would make it into the DLC. And the one resembling Voltron, in my opinion, not surprisingly takes the victory. Next is Giga Bash, what I think is probably the closest we're going to get to a spiritual successor to Pipeworks series, and only helped by the fact that they've now got a Godzilla DLC pack, which features absolutely beautiful renditions of the characters, with my only disappointment being the fact that they chose Kiryu as their Mechagodzilla rep instead of Mechagodzilla 1. The game is developed by Passion Republic, of which the passion is clearly prevalent, and my hope is that the game does well and gets more DLC to come, and we can really see what the design team is capable of. Overall, a spectacular looking game that hopefully will reignite the Arena Kaiju Fighter series. Terror of Hemosaurus is another fascinating title which displays good pixel graphics but largely seems to be a more involved take on Rampage. It also displays a decent physics engine which can have buildings topple upon one another. While Ethan was an evolution of the formula, this one seems to be an upgrade to it. And it really shows. It's developed by Lauren Lemke, who surprisingly developed this by himself and is developing games all of the style of arcade games. So good luck to him. And in terms of releases, we're going down to the strangest of them, which is Kaiju. It's, well, you play as a kaiju who dates other kaiju. Not exactly a traditional kaiju affair, but is certainly charming in its own right. There are 6 other kaiju, all have their own storylines, and are all styled after visual novels, so should be a good play. So in conclusion, kaiju games outside the aforementioned big 2 are a very mixed bag, favoring unfavorable. The games as of late, however, are proving to be exceptionally well made and thought out, trying to perfect their predecessors' shortcomings and of course adding some new type of blood to the mix. Note, of course, there are plenty of games that involve kaiju that I'm sure I'm not mentioning because it simply isn't pertinent to the parameters of this, and I'm also likely missed quite a few that should have made the list simply because I overlooked them. The next 2 videos will be on Godzilla and Ultraman's run and dominance over the kaiju video game sphere.
So if you're hearing this, thank you so much for watching till the end. Be sure to subscribe and like and whatever else you feel like doing. This is the first of what I'm calling the survey class of videos I'm doing, which will just be briefer, less thought out explanations on certain topics. Basically just get my thoughts out and produce shorter but more informational videos, compact, all that. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Carver out.